Thank you, Bart, and welcome to everybody. The International IVF Initiative is honored to be hosting the second edition for the journal Reproductive Biomedicine Online. For videos of the previous session, please go to ivfmeeting.com. You will also find some information about the upcoming very interesting session on the same page. Thanks for logging in, and I really encourage you to ask questions, but you have to do it in a Q&A session and not in the chat, please. I am here today with the chief editor of RBMO, Professor Bart Fauser, who will be moderating this session together with me. I have known Bart for many years, and you should really look to his amazing bio on our website. It's really an honor for me. He has been involved in almost every aspect of assisted reproductive technologies and has published more than 500 papers. Wow, congratulations, Bart. Bart has also held a prestigious position in academic institutions in the Netherlands and holds numerous leading professional society positions. Welcome, Bart.
Thank you, Laura. That's a very flattering introduction. Thank you very much. So, yes, my name is Bart Fauser. I'm the editor-in-chief of RBM Online and chairing this session tonight with Laura Rienzi. She is an editor as of early this year, focusing on embryology. As you know, RBMO has a major long-standing background in embryology. And Laura is a senior clinical embryologist and laboratory director of Genera Centers for Reproductive Medicine in Italy, which she co-founded with Filippo Ubaldi in 2008. She has been active in many different societies all over the world, been also certainly very active in research and published numerous papers, all of course focus on embryology and how it affects safety, effectiveness, but also focusing on human gametes and zygotes, and so a very, very broad scope. For this evening, let's spend a little time because we selected 4 publications published recently in our journal, which will be highlighted this evening. The format that we chose is that there's going to be one first presenter, which is a more comprehensive, longer lecture, and thereafter the speech session, including 3 all different aspects, really representing the wide scope of the journal. It started, this journal, in the year 2000 by Professor Bob Edwards, of course, with a heavy focus on clinical embryology, but also basic science. And we try to maintain that legacy. So it's all from basic science to implementation. It is mainly IVF, but all different aspects, including reproductive endocrinology, technology and society. We have a new section, the RTS section, which started last year, which is a little bit away from the real science, but more what does it mean in terms of the society context nowadays. We look back at a very fruitful, productive year. We have focused on rapid review process so that authors who submit their manuscripts will know very timely whether we will continue with the process of refereeing, but also the time towards acceptance. We increase the volume and increase the scope, so the number of papers published, and all this certainly also results in a steady increase in the impact factor of the journal. So all in all, I have to say that we are pretty happy where we are, active as always. There's always numerous things we should do, and we have numerous plans for the future. We added new initiatives, for instance, something that we are going to start. So if you're interested, let me know. It's called a contribution next to the commentary, which we already have, where people can air their opinions about certain areas, but now countercurrent session, where we focus on people that come with different views against the mainstream. So I'd like to reassure you that we are still open for all new ideas, and we would welcome your feedback about this session, about the journal, and certainly also we would welcome your future contributions for consideration for publication. Let me now give the floor back to Laura, please. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, but no, I'm on mute. Sorry. So I'm going to present the first speaker, or it's Mina Alikani. I'm so happy. Thank you, Bart, because for me, Mina is really one of the greatest embryologists, and has been an example for me. And I grew up with her papers. So Mina has more than 35 years of experience in clinical embryology, focusing on IVF laboratory. She has always done a very meticulous practice with detailed observation, embracing new technology and teaching and training over all this time. So Mina is really a reference for us in the embryology session. Mina has lectured worldwide on many different topics. She has more than 80 articles published. She's an editor of RBM, and she's in the editorial board of Fertility and Fertility. Of course, I encourage you to look to her bio, her full bio on our website. Mina lives in New York. So what time is in New York in this moment, Mina?
It's 3:15, 3:10.
So it's a great time to make a very interesting lecture. So please, Mina, the floor is for you.
Thank you so much. You can see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Excellent. That's a good start. Thank you so much, Laura, for that lovely introduction. As you mentioned, I've had the privilege of being involved in RBMO since 2015. First as a section editor and then as an editor. So I'm very excited to be presenting at this live session, and I'm also grateful to I3 for facilitating it. In recent years, RBMO has published a number of consensus papers, some of which are listed here. Most recently, I had the pleasure of handling a paper that was not quite a consensus, but a very interesting global perspective on management of the IVF lab during the pandemic. These are all excellent contributions, and I invite you to read them if you have not done so already. You might ask now, why are consensus papers important, and what function do they serve? Well, a consensus really encourages dialogue, debate, and discussion. It promotes an examination and re-examination of ideas and beliefs, and it also discourages an anecdote or myth-driven, if you will, approach to practice. My task today is to give you a taste of how helpful consensus papers can be to practitioners, and why they should be read carefully, and why RBMO would like to publish more of these papers. These papers are usually the product of collaboration among an international group of practitioners and experts who present the current state of the art, engage in a facilitated discussion of each topic, and through this discussion and debate, develop a set of guidelines and recommendations that will then be reviewed, peer-reviewed, and published in the journal. And today's paper that I would like to cover is one such example. The title is quite catchy. There's only one thing that is truly important in an IVF laboratory: everything. And isn't that the truth? This meeting was was coordinated by Dr. Mohammad Fauser of Egypt, and included many expert practitioners and others who participated, including Dr. Sharon-Weiner, who was the reporter who had a heavy burden of writing down everything that was said and discussed, Dr. Alison Campbell, Dr. Rakowski, Dr. Raga Mansour, Dr. David Mortimer, Dr. James Catt, Dr. Morbeck, Dr. Janssens, Dr. Mindres, Dr. Mastenbrook, Dr. Rieger, Dr. Cohen, and Dr. Swain. On this occasion, I'd like to dedicate this talk to Dr. Raga Mansour, my dear friend, our colleague of many years, the Egyptian IVF pioneer, physician, scientist, and artist, who sadly passed away last December. She was a member of the 2018 Cairo Consensus Group, and as always, made significant contributions to the discussions. I miss her dearly, and I know all of us miss her terribly. I wish that she was here today. So the guidelines were developed based on best available evidence or expert opinion and experiences. The outcomes that were considered in these discussions, sorry about that, let me go back. The outcomes that were considered included development of embryos in vitro, how well they developed post-transfer viability with an emphasis on implantation rate, taking into account the number of embryos that were transferred, as well as patient safety, both mother and child and or children, time to pregnancy, and cost. In this way, the group was able to come to more than 50 consensus points, all of which are, of course, covered in the paper. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm only covering a sampling of these consensus points and topics, but the topics were very, very wide-ranging, starting with basic principles and indications regarding embryo culture, then moving on to factors like humidity, temperature, pH, carbon dioxide, oxygen tension, and then also incubators, other equipment, monitoring of equipment, micromanipulation environment, on and on. The paper is significant and it does take some time to read, but these are all the various topics that we covered during the meeting. So on embryo assessment, for example, we all agreed that maintaining proper physical-chemical conditions during the assessment is critically important, as is working quickly to keep assessment to a maximum of 2 minutes while the oocytes and embryos are outside the incubator. However, there was really no consensus on optimal timing and frequency of assessments. But of course, we considered that time-lapse systems really make this requirement for deciding on timing and frequency completely moot, and they provide much more detailed information on embryo development. The timing is flexible, and the assessments are done in a protective environment, since the embryos do not have to be removed from the incubator while we assess them. On sperm handling, the recommendations for preparation of semen are based on some basic proven principles. First, that the contamination of prepared sperm with trace amounts of seminal plasma can significantly decrease fertilizing ability. So effective removal of seminal fluid is critical to the success of the semen preparation, whether it's by swim up gradient, density gradient, or microfluidic means. They all work, but the goal is to completely remove the seminal fluid and avoid formation of reactive oxygen species. Since bicarbonate is required for capacitation, standard insemination samples should be resuspended in fertilization medium, even though the medium that is most commonly used for processing of the semen contains buffers such as HEPs and MOPs. This is not required for ICSI samples because, of course, we put a very minute portion of the prepared sample into PVP, and so maintenance and capacitation is not really required. So maintenance in a bicarbonate buffered medium is not required. The recommendation is to hold the prepared specimens for ICSI at room temperature, while it's recommended that something around 2 hours before standard IVF insemination to bring the temperature of the prepared sample to 37 degrees. On oocyte and embryo handling, the group agreed that the main concern is maintenance of temperature as close to 37 degrees as possible. It's important to remember that heat loss occurs in pipettes, needles, and catheters, and in glass pipette tips, this loss could be as high as 5 degrees in 5 seconds. So it's very important to work fast. And by the way, heating catheters and pipettes and instruments like that that come in contact with gametes and embryos is not really effective, it could be counterproductive. And so it's discouraged. Instead, we have to use oil and work fast, as fast as we can in order to avoid excessive exposure to ambient air and a drop in temperature. Equally important is the maintenance of osmolality to about 250 to 290 milliosmoles per kilogram. In order to maintain osmolality, it's important to prevent evaporation of the culture medium. And in this sense, humidity and oil both help. But again, working fast is important. Maintenance of pH, again, very important, and to make sure that pH is relatively stable, we have to limit the time of exposure to ambient air, again, use oil and work fast. And of course, during all handling of gametes and embryos, we have to remember that these are live cells and we cannot treat them like ping pong balls and take them up and down pipettes and expect that they don't react to this, this sort of mechanical stress. They do, and we should not expose them to that kind of stress. On buffering and a pH, it's important to maintain a narrow and stable pH-E. Important to establish that range properly. Of course, the range varies based on media and ingredients, but generally it's between 7.2 and 7.35. Even though in the paper we say 7.20, I think it's important to keep in mind that really, I don't know of anyone who keeps the pH at 7.20. I would change this to essentially 7.25 to 3.5, and even 2.5 might be a bit too low. But as I said here, and we agreed during the meeting, and Jason Swain has published quite a bit on this topic, there is no ideal pH really that we can define. So appropriate CO2 level has to be based on the target pH, and it of course varies based on elevation and the media composition. We agreed that despite some doubt in the literature that buffers like HEPs and MOPs are safe for stabilizing pH outside the incubator. So for short-term manipulation of oocytes and embryos, it's perfectly fine. But we don't know the prolonged, impact of prolonged exposure of gametes and embryos to these buffers. On light, we agreed that the main source of exposure is microscope light, but of course there's also ceiling lights and natural light. If you have windows in your laboratory, the impact can be on oil in the form of peroxidation, or even culture media leading to some degradation. The impact on gametes and embryos has been shown in animal studies, but not shown directly in humans, but it's best avoided. And the intensity, the duration of light exposure, and the wavelength all should be considered during all IVF procedures. Regarding temperature QC, we have to use appropriately calibrated and maintained and sensitive instruments and devices to measure and validate all surface temperatures. On incubators, the stability of the environment is very important. That's why temperature QC, gas supply, and monitoring the number of door openings is very important. A control on VOCs is important. That's why inline filters are placed, and incubator management involves very meticulous preventive maintenance, daily quality control, and possibly continuous monitoring. And, you know, I wanted to bring up this paper with respect to quality control in the lab, that we published this paper in RBMO in 2019, and in which I3's very own Giles Palmer, Jacques Cohn, and other colleagues used an innovative method to assess QC performance by 36 different laboratories around the world. And it became clear that about half the effort of quality control in IVF labs is really centered on incubators. And it really shows how important the maintenance of that environment for culture is to practice. So on balance, we didn't answer all the unanswered questions, but generally agreed that 5% O2 is superior to 20% O2, that culture at 37 degrees C was better than less than 37 degrees C. pH measurements are important, more important than possibly CO2 measurements alone. Use of commercial culture media is better than homemade media because of the rigorous quality control. And we did discuss some facets of blastocyst transfer and fresh and frozen embryo transfer as well, though we don't have really time to get into that. There were some areas where the evidence was equivocal, including, for example, the use of humid versus dry incubation, and as I said, optimal pH. Thank you so much for your attention. I would like to invite you, as Bart did, to submit your papers to RBMO and read RBMO. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mina. Thank you. It was really an excellent presentation, and I really enjoy reading this paper. You know what, Mina? Reading this paper, this paper really focus on the importance of the environment around the embryo. Physical and chemical conditions around the embryo, which are very difficult to maintain. Don't you think that today we have too many sessions about embryo selection and not enough about embryo culture per se, which probably is the only key for the success?
Yeah, you make a very, very good point, Laura. It's very clear that the environment is exceedingly important in the determination of the outcome. And it's so complicated. It is so complex. The smallest change can have a huge impact on the outcome. And so it is very important for practitioners to talk and to discuss their experiences and what things they consider as being important, and how we should best control the environment in which the embryos and gametes are maintained. That is an extremely important topic, and I do agree that we need to talk more. What happens when a manufacturer suddenly changes a component in the medium and you start seeing an effect on embryo development? How do we manage that? What happens when pH seems to be off and you are having trouble bringing it under control? All of these things are important. I think we should be discussing the topic much more than we do.
So we encourage colleagues to submit paper on this topic also to our journal. It will be really very interesting for us and for the embryologist community. Thank you, Mina.
Thank
See
you so
later
much.
on during the
Yes.
Q&A session. Now I'm going to introduce a new idea, the speed session.
Sorry, Laura, let's spend a few minutes on additional questions for Mina. We'll have the questions together in the speed session, but for this, some separate questions. Is that okay?
Of course. Sorry, Bart.
No. Okay, Mina, thanks a lot. Let me, in the transition to, because I see there are some questions from the audience, but let me first, you mentioned about different culture media. When you come with all these complex, best practice recommendations about temperature and light and all the things you mentioned, it suggests that you can come up with one recommendation that would be equivalent for all different commercial culture media. Is there any evidence that these conditions may vary from one medium compared to the other?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bart. We agreed, during this meeting, we agreed that the conditions of culture are really best established by the laboratory using the culture media and using specific incubators and the like. Because even though the composition, let's say two separate labs are using the same medium, but I set my incubators, I use incubator X and I set my incubator conditions, let's say CO2 conditions at 6.9%. But my colleague who is, also at sea level and uses the same medium, it finds out that with his incubators that he has better development at a CO2 level of 6.0.
Yeah.
And so it's very, very important to establish those things practically for yourself, for the laboratory, even though some common practices are shared really by all users of the media.
Thank you. Let's move to some questions from the audience, because you mentioned it several times about wavelength in terms of light. What would be recommended there, or would you recommend to work in a more dark environment without outside light?
Yeah, we would definitely discourage, if you have windows, we would discourage having natural light come in. And we would cover all windows in that to prevent that. Also, in terms of microscope lights, which are really a main concern, we would try to minimize the amount of light that the embryos are exposed to, while making sure that visibility is still kept, well. And so we can make observations, but not expose embryos to unnecessary amount of light. In terms of the laboratory itself, we always dim the lights. And again, the literature on animal embryos is there to say and supports the limiting of exposure to all kinds of light. We don't have any data specifically for human embryos, but we take the precaution of dimming the lights in all areas where gametes and embryos have to come out of the incubator.
Another question for you, Mina, from the audience. You focus much on factors affecting embryo quality. How about competence of oocytes? Which are the laboratory changes or factors that could affect competence of oocytes rather than embryo per se?
So, everything you do can affect the competence of oocytes and embryos. What we are aiming to do is to maintain their competence. We can't increase the competence, but we can certainly decrease the competence. We want to maintain their sort of innate competence. And I think the title of this paper really says it all. There are hundreds of factors that can affect the competence of gametes and embryos that we handle during the in vitro culture process.
In your view, what are the most important factors that could decrease competence of oocytes?
Competence of oocytes, I think temperature maintenance is very, very important, because oocytes are very sensitive to temperature variations. I think that actual shear stress, mechanical stress to oocytes during, for example, hyaluronidase treatments can have detrimental effects on oocytes. We should absolutely treat them as they are live cells and not really lose sight of that while we are pipetting them back and forth. So temperature, stress, shear stress, and other stresses, oxidative stress, other stresses in culture.
Mina, thank you very much. We have to
My
stop.
pleasure.
There are more questions. Maybe later on we will have time. We will have now to move to the speech session. And
Thank
Laura,
you.
please take the stand and introduce the speech session.
Yes, thank you, Bart. The speed session is really very exciting because we will have 3 excellent papers that has been selected, being published in the last month on RBMO. We have also 1 review. All articles can be found, of course, online, and our excellent speakers' bios also can be found online. So we have Dr. Martin Stimpfel, Professor Fady Sharara, and Dr. Maya Sharon-Weiner. So I will briefly introduce them before the lecture. So Martin is the head of the RBF laboratory in the Department of Human Reproduction, Obstetrics and Gynecology, University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. He began his career focusing on stem cell and reproduction, and now he's mainly focused on sperm selection method in ART, epigenetic factors in the sperm. He's a member of the ESHRE, current national representative, and he holds a position as a basic scientist in ESHRE Committee of National Representative. As I told you, for more information, you will find his full bio on our website. Then it's my pleasure to introduce you also Fady Sharara, Medical Director and founder of the VCRM Center. Professor Sharara is a board-certified reproductive endocrinologist, infertility specialist with extensive experience in all aspects of infertility, especially assisted reproductive technology. Professor Sharara is a clinical professor at George Washington University and has more than 80 scientific publications and book chapters. He's a recipient of multiple academic, clinical, and scientific awards. Dr. Sharara will give more than 250 invited lectures. And finally, we have Dr. Maya Sharon-Weiner. She's a doctor. She's part of a senior staff physician at the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the Meir Medical Center in Israel. She's currently participating in the subspecialty training program in infertility and reproductive medicine in the IVF unit of the same hospital. I really welcome with the bottom of my heart all the speakers enjoying to make this presentation. We will start with Martin. The presentation is pre-recorded, but Martin is together with us. And he's going to talk about collecting semen samples at home for IVF ICSI does not negatively affect the outcome of a fresh cycle. We can start the video. Thank you.
Inviting me, it really is a pleasure to be a part of such a great IVF initiative and have this presentation. So I'm going to talk about if it's okay to collect semen samples at home for IVF and ICSI procedures, and if this has any negative effect on the cycle's outcome. The idea for this paper, we got it when the pandemic started, and we were checking what are the guidelines from the society, from the professional societies, how to proceed with ART procedures. One of the suggestions was to minimize the time the patients are spending at the clinics, and of course, one approach is also to bring the semen samples from home. We started this already in year 2017 because we had some renovations at our clinic, and we were forced to suggest to patients that they bring the semen samples from home. And when we realized that this doesn't have any negative effect on the cycle's outcome, we followed this approach in following years. Because we realized that there is not many data in the literature, we prepared this paper, and we've collected all the data, from all the cycles from year 2019, and this is more than 1,000 cycles. We performed generalized estimating equations analysis, and with regarding to the semen quality, we find out that the concentration and the motility was even better if the semen samples were collected at home. We followed with analysis of cycles, what were the outcome, And basically there was no difference between the groups. The only difference we observed was not part of this, was not really important from the perspective if the semen is collected at home, because there was difference in proportion of polyploidies and in freeze-all cycles between this group. When we prepared this paper, we didn't have any data about deliveries and abortion, so we added this data now, and as you can see, it doesn't seem that the approach for semen collection would have any negative effect. Besides this analysis, we also performed some other analyses. We analyzed only first cycles, because in this analysis all the cycles are together. And also, if we analyzed only first cycles, the results were very similar. We didn't find any significant difference in the outcome between the tested groups. Also, we checked if there is any difference if we analyze the data regarding to a fertilization procedure, meaning if we compare classical IVF, insemination, and ICSI, and we didn't find any difference. There was some differences if we checked the data regarding the proportion of mature oocytes. We did this because in some pre-analysis and also during the peer-review procedure, we had a discussion if this might have any effect. We found out if we analyzed the subgroup of the patients, the subgroup was consisted with patients who had more than 9 oocytes and less than 17% of immature oocytes. This was the average. And we realized that in this case, the pregnancy rate was even lower if the semen was collected at clinic. But here I show only a few most important data, but you can check all other tables and results at Reproductive Biomedicine Online Journal at their web page. So to conclude, we find out that collecting semen at home might have even a positive effect on sperm quality because sperm concentration and motility were higher. We didn't find any significant difference in terms of oocytes, embryos, and pregnancies if semen is collected at home. Therefore, we can suggest that this approach is safe and has no negative effect on treatment outcomes.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Back to the future. I mean, it's nice when all things come back. And I think that collecting at home may have some positive impact on patients. Don't you think that for men, it's easier to collect at home? It's less invasive to ask a patient to collect at home instead, but in a hospital with people around and sometimes not in an adequate location?
Yes, we ask them if they want to collect semen at home or they prefer clinic. Most of the patients agreed to collect the semen samples at home. It's less stressful for them.
Yeah, I think we have to think also about patient care, and whatever we can do to improve their feelings is really important. Thank you, Martin. See you back in the Q&A session. We move to Professor Sharara for the next lecture. 2008 financial crisis versus 2020 economic fallout, how COVID-19 might influence fertility treatment and live births. Please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Rienzi, for the kind introduction, and Dr. Fauser and the editors at RBMO. I'd like to thank also my co-authors, Dr. Gromsky, Dr. Smith, Dr. Lawler, and Dr. Nelson. So we all know what's going on, and our paper is entitled 2008 Financial Crisis versus 2020 Economic Fallout, how COVID-19 might influence fertility treatment and live birth. Next slide, please. So as we all know, the first COVID case was reported on December 31st, 2019 in Wuhan, China. regardless of the paper in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about 3 lab employees having flu-like symptoms in November. Probably Laura can elaborate a little bit, but there are also reports on flu-like symptoms and weird pneumonias in Milano as early as November of 2019, actually. But be that as it may, the first case in the US was on January 21st, 2020 near Seattle. ASRM on March 17 recommended suspension of IVF cases. 87% of the clinics in the US followed suit and closed for 8 weeks on average, followed by a gradual uptick. And up till now, ASRM has published 15 updates on COVID in terms of resumption of IVF services. Obviously, that was followed by major unemployment and a stock market crash. The stock market crashed by 28% between February 11th and March 12th of 2020. The unemployment in the US soared with nearly 22 million out of a job within a matter of weeks. And clearly that was a black swan event with no recent historic precedent, whose impact is expected to last well into 2023 and probably beyond. What got us interested in looking at this was a paper that was published on December 17th, 2020 by the Brookings Institute, entitled The Coming COVID-19 Baby Bust, which suggested up to 500,000 less babies born in the US by 2023. So we decided to look at previous models, and the only model that we had available was the 2008 financial crisis, even though it was an imperfect model because it was just a financial crisis in the US and not a global phenomenon. So we decided to look at IVF utilization from 1999 up to 2018, looking at the CDC ART reports and projecting what utilization in the US would be between 2020 and 2023. Next slide, please. So what you see on the slide are 2 panels. The panel on the left is the impact of the 2008 financial crisis. And you clearly see that the number of IVF cycles in the US was increasing steadily up till 2008. And the blue line and the shaded area are the what would, if there was no financial crisis, what the number of IVF cycles would have continued, and the 95% confidence interval. And what really happened. So the first one, A, is in women less than 35. The second one is in women 35 to 37, then 38 to 40, and then 40 to 41. There was very few cases in women above 42 to be able to put a panel in there. But you can clearly see that between 2008 and 2012, there was actually a drop in IVF cycles for all women younger than 40. So there was no drop in women over 40. What was predicted to happen actually did happen. And the right panel is actually the COVID thing that we're predicting, the model that we have. So if you look at the number of cycles up to 2018, that's the last reported CDC data. We projected based on the growth over the past few years, what the number of cycles would have been in the US, which is the line in blue, and the shaded area is the 95% CI. And then we projected if an economic crisis like the one in 2008 would happen, we would see the black line and with a drop. And then we modeled for COVID, 50% worse than the 2008 versus 50% less severe as that of 2008. And this is what you see for the women less than 35, 35 to 37, 38 to 40, 40 to 41, and more than 42. And again, what we're saying in this, that women above 40 would have practically no drop or a very minimal drop in COVID. And most of the brunt of the decrease in IVF cycles would be observed in women less than 40, especially women younger than 35. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, what our data showed, the financial recession of 2008 caused a 4-year plateau in fertility treatments with a predicted 53,000 fewer IVF cycles and 16,872 fewer live births. A similar scale of economic recession would cause 67,386 fewer IVF cycles between 2020 and 2023, with women younger than 35 overall undertaking 22,504 less IVF cycles compared to 4,445 fewer IVF cycles in women over 40. This equates to an overall 25,143 fewer predicted live births from IVF, from which only 490 would be in women over 40. So what has changed since COVID happened? The first stimulus plan in the US that eventually included printing trillions of dollars was approved by Congress on March 27, 2020. It was called the CARES Act. We submitted the first draft of the paper in 2020. At the time, only the Brookings paper was published, and we are glad RBMO accepted the paper, but we sent it to a couple of other papers and they did not believe our modeling. Despite the generous handouts since over $6 trillion, recent studies still point to a substantially lower number of babies born, not just in the US, but very possibly worldwide. It remains to be seen whether our projections into 2023 will materialize, or whether the massive public handouts still ongoing in the US have cushioned the impact. We still believe women younger than 35 remain at the most risk of not seeking care or delaying starting a family. The 2008 crisis resulted in shifting for the mean age of women seeking infertility care by about 2 years. And we would love to have our European and South American and the rest of the world colleagues look at this and try to see what impact it's going to cause in their societies. And I'm going to stop here and entertain any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharara. There's going to be a Q&A after the three speech sessions, but let me ask you one question. Yes, indeed, an intriguing analysis. Could you speculate a little more on, so you have observed what happened in 2008, the economic recession. In COVID, at least in Europe, the economic recession is much less pronounced, number one. And number two, there it's not just money, but it's also the COVID itself, of course, how it affects individuals, how it may affect pregnancy, how that may prevent people from the wish. So could you speculate a little in a little greater detail about the similarities and the differences between the crisis now and the financial crisis in 2008?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So obviously the model of looking at 2008 is nowhere near what we're seeing with COVID. Okay, so what we saw in 2008 was a financial one. So not many people lost their jobs, but it was mainly a financial sector that was affected. Obviously, hotels and travel industry, everything kept going, but we definitely saw that drop in 2008 of people not being able to afford IVF. And definitely in the US, the model is very different because we don't have socialized medicine. So we have 15 states in the US that offer IVF mandates, but for the rest, there's no mandate and patients have to pay for this. COVID, there's also the fear factor. So for the first time, we started seeing young women not wanting to have children. So this is new. Obviously, the disease itself, we just did not know early on if COVID is going to be like Zika and cause congenital anomalies in newborn. So the fear factor was absolutely real. And what we saw, at least in the first few months after COVID, very few women wanted to come in and do IVF. They just didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't have vaccines. Obviously now at least about 60% of the adult population in the US is vaccinated. And that's not the case for the most of the world. So we cannot really project what's going on in the US on the rest of the world. But there have been many publications since the first paper, all pointing to the same thing, that this is much worse than people are anticipating. And the fear of young women delaying having children is a real thing. And I would love to hear what's going on in the Netherlands or what's going on in Italy and the rest of the world, whether this is what you're seeing or not. Even though IVF is paid for, are patients coming in to have children?
Thank you very much. We'll have time for discussion later on, but we now have to move to the third and last presenter, Dr. Maya Sharon-Weiner, and she will speak about a totally different topic, conception after early IVF pregnancy loss. Should we wait? Please, Dr. Sharon.
Thank you. Hello to you all. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today about my research named Conception After Early IVF Pregnancy Loss. Should we wait? Next slide, please. So we all know that infertile couples facing IVF treatment are often very anxious, as the process is physically and emotionally challenging. But of special interest is the chance of achieving pregnancy following a recent IVF cycle that ended in early pregnancy loss. Approximately 5% of in vitro fertilization cycles end in early pregnancy loss, representing 50% of pregnancies resulting from IVF. But the literature contains conflicting data concerning the prognostic impact of a pregnancy loss on the subsequent IVF cycles. Some reported a higher success rate after first trimester miscarriage during the next IVF attempt, while others reported that miscarriages negatively affects conception rate. The IVF population includes a large proportion of women with a time-sensitive diagnosis who may desire a subsequent pregnancy immediately following a miscarriage. And the data regarding the importance of the interval between preclinical or clinical pregnancy loss during IVF treatment and the outcome of the subsequent cycle are limited. So the research question was, is the interval length between an early pregnancy loss and the following treatment cycle a predictor for achieving clinical pregnancy among IVF patients? That was a retrospective cohort study of 257 women who reinitiated treatment after first trimester IVF pregnancy loss between the 1st of January 2014 to the 2018. The inclusion criteria were women aged 18 to 40 with normal uterine cavity who experienced first trimester pregnancy loss at less than 14 weeks after IVF, and they were included. Miscarriages were classified as spontaneous, biochemical, medical, or surgical. The primary outcome measure was the result of the IVF cycle after the miscarriage. Next slide, please. So these are the results, some of the results. So 287 women who experienced first trimester IVF pregnancy loss were identified. Baseline characteristics, including maternal age and paternal age and BMI and smoking status and gravity and parity and basal FSH and infertility type and IVF indication cycle sequential number were presented at the article at table 1. In general, 32.7% patients achieved a pregnancy in the first cycle following the pregnancy loss. The mean interval from the first trimester pregnancy loss to the following cycle was 109.2 days, and the median was 70 days. Table 2, as you can see, describes the baseline and cycle characteristics in the first IVF cycle following a pregnancy loss. According to clinical pregnancy outcome, there was no significant differences in the intervals from pregnancy loss to the next IVF cycle between the 84 women who achieved pregnancy and the 173 who did not. And no other background characteristics was significantly different between these two groups, except that more embryos were transferred in the group that achieved pregnancy. In a survival analysis for the time interval by type of miscarriage, as presented in figure 2, we found that after a chemical pregnancy or spontaneous miscarriage, patients experienced significantly shorter interval to next cycle as compared with miscarriages managed medically or surgically. We did also a logistic regression analysis as presented in table 3 that showed that the chance of subsequent pregnancy was affected by the number of embryos transferred and the type of miscarriage. Medical and surgical miscarriages were related to lower likelihood of pregnancy compared with biochemical pregnancy, which was the reference group. Next slide, please, and the last one. So in conclusion, first, among patients diagnosed with first trimester pregnancy loss after an IVF cycle, the interval to the subsequent IVF treatment was not associated with the chance of achieving a clinical pregnancy. Second, the type of miscarriage was associated with pregnancy outcomes. Miscarriage managed medically and surgically were related to a smaller chance of achieving clinical pregnancy as compared to chemical and spontaneous miscarriages. Also, when clinical pregnancy was achieved in the first post-miscarriage cycle, the chance of a live birth was higher with shorter intervals, whereas another miscarriage was significantly related to a longer interval between miscarriage and the next IVF cycle. So in conclusion, based on our results, resumption of IVF after a pregnancy loss should not be postponed. On the contrary, shorter intervals were associated with greater likelihood of live birth. So thank you for listening, and I would like to thank Dr. Anat Hershko and Professor Adrian Schulman at the IVF unit at Meir Medical Center in Israel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sharon. A clear presentation. Before we move to the quick Q&A session with the audience, let me start with asking you one question. Your conclusion is clear based on the data. My question to you would be, is this only restricted to IVF? We know early pregnancy loss also happens after natural conception. Would it be different under those circumstances, or would you recommend those women as well that they can start working on the next pregnancy fast and they don't have to wait?
Well, actually, the idea for this research came from the fertile population. And we thought maybe we should examine it on the subfertile population. So the literature is conflicting also about this population. Some of them recommend to wait for half a year. Some of them recommend to wait only 2 months. So I can't be very clear about it. There are very limited data about it. But we concluded that maybe in our population, IVF population, women who were treated with a surgical treatment are maybe they are different population than the others. So different characteristics. But I can't be sure, I can't be conclusive about what you asked.
Okay, thank you very much. We can now move to the Q&A session. Laura, could you start, please?
Of course, my pleasure. So there is a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to pick up 2 or 3 together for Martin. Martin, are you
Yeah, here.
Okay, so are you ready? So the questions are related to traceability of the sample. Many centers does not allow the patient to collect at home. And also regarding the timing for deliver the sample, the timing for preparation.
Okay, about the time, we advise the patients that the semen samples should be delivered to clinic if it's possible within an hour, but the maximum time should be 1 hour and a half. Well, our clinic has some advantage here because our city is in the middle of the country, so most patients don't need more than an hour to come to our clinic, so this is an advantage for us. About traceability, when the patient collects the semen sample at home, that doesn't mean that somebody else brings this sample to the clinic. They bring the sample by themselves, and they also sign the consent that the sample is theirs, and they're giving it for the procedure. So there is no trouble with traceability.
Easier in a small country with a very well located center, but so I agree, but if it's too long and the patient is too far from the center, it's more difficult.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you.
advise the patients if there is more than 1 hour and a half, they think they will come to clinic, they should collect the sample at the clinic.
Thank you. So an opportunity, but not for all, depending on where they live. Can I make another question, Bart?
Yes, please do.
Thank you. To Professor Sharara, I really enjoy your lecture. I really love this kind of exercise. It's fantastic to try to prevent what can happen and help maybe somehow to moderate the effect of a crisis or a pandemic situation. But I have quite positive message from Italy. So we were the first European country affected by the virus. It's clear that spontaneous pregnancy in December 2020, the first data available, because we were in lockdown in March. So the first natural pregnancy, the delivery of the first natural pregnancy are, of course, end of November and December. And unfortunately, we have a big drop. And Italy, it's already really in a very high grade of denatality. So we are very worried about this. Instead of being -3-4% for December, we are -10. But the good news, this was the bad part of the story, but the good news is that IVF is growing in every population very fast. So I believe that lockdown, March, April, and May for us was terrible for spontaneous conception, the fears, the unknown situation. IVF patients were stopped. But after the lockdown, at least IVF patients are growing a lot. So this is really for us a surprise and I think a positive message that we should check better all around the world.
I think that's a great message. Unfortunately, this is not what we're seeing in the US. There are few states that have reported their birth rate for 2020. California, for example, is 13.4% down in 2020 compared to 2019. So as you know, the US without immigration would be a negative population growth. Many countries are like this, unfortunately, now. So we have to see what the future is going to hold in the US. Obviously, one of the things we did not factor in the paper was the effect of frozen embryo transfer that may have. And as we all know, in the US, we're doing much more PGTA cycles than regular cycles. So the number of fresh cycles per se may not reflect really the outcome afterwards. As more and more, we surpass the number of frozen embryo transfers where more than fresh cycles started increasing beyond the number of fresh cycles about 2 years ago. And I expect this trend is going to continue. So we're doing less fresh starts, and the number of FATs is going through the roof. So we'll have to see what happens. For at least for the US, I'm very happy that at least in Italy, patients are coming to have babies. This is not what we're seeing in the US.
But the deliveries in 2020 in the US are not related to the pandemic because patients were, yeah, it was. So the decrease is consistent. I mean, it's something
the decrease has been, the fertility rate has been decreasing anyway all over Western Europe and the US, and this trend is continuing. We're seeing older women coming in. I mean, the mean age in the US is about 4 years older than it is in Europe. And this is a huge problem for us. I mean, at least in my clinic, I rarely see patients younger than 35 coming in to see me.
Yeah, we have the same.
I have a follow-up question for you, Professor Sharara. Several people, they zoom in on spontaneous or natural conception in women on the waiting list because they would qualify for IVF, but because of the lockdown, they didn't get any. Particularly Dr. Parikh mentioned specifically that he has seen a lot of spontaneous pregnancies in couples who were on the waiting list, even the older ones, even the ones with low AMH. Is that also your experience?
Well, we don't have waiting lists in the US. At least, you know, for most the clinics that I know,
no,
patients.
But during the lockdown, so they
we only shut down. Yeah, we only shut down for about 8 weeks. I actually was one of the 13% of the clinics that remained open. Very few patients were coming during that time, but you know, in an 8-week time frame, we definitely did not experience many patients calling us telling us that they were pregnant. We have a much harder core patient population in big cities in the US. Mina can collaborate on this, but we, you know, for most of us in the US, the biggest diagnosis is actually diminished ovarian reserve, which is age related. We don't see young patients coming in, so that doesn't mean we will see a lot of patients getting pregnant while they're on the waiting list. We just don't see that in the US.
Okay.
We have some Australia, Karen Bell, telling us that they also experienced a big surge in IVF patients in Australia, 2020 and 21. On the other hand, Scott Nelson is telling us that for spontaneous delivery, there is a fall in the first month of 2020, a reduced birth rate in US and UK, which can be really related this time to the pandemic and the lockdown.
Let's hope so. I mean, obviously, we would love this to be the case. At least in the US, there's more economic papers coming out telling us that the baby boom is just not going to happen in the US.
No, there is a drop in birth.
A drop, yes.
A drop, yeah, in US.
No question. No question. This is what we're seeing here in the US. So I'm happy Australia is picking up. I'm happy other places in the country are picking up. You look at where India is right now, I cannot imagine there's a baby boom happening in the middle of this pandemic that's going on, probably in many other places in the world. As I said, a lot of countries just don't have vaccination enough to inoculate people. And even in the US, 24% of the population will not get a vaccine. So we still have vaccine deniers, unfortunately. So it again, I think I'm very happy that RBMO is looking to get papers like these that have economic impacts and real life potential on predicting the future. And the hardest thing, as we all know, is really predicting what's going to happen. So we surely hope we are mistaken in our assessment, but we are a bit skeptical that this is going to be the case.
So number one, I would like to invite the audience to come up with questions about our third presentation, Dr. Sharon. And while you are thinking and exploring the options for further discussion, I would like to come back to the first presenter, Dr. Stimpfel. And there is one question about from Dr. Berger about the mechanism of action. Why do you believe that sperm quality increases when collected at home? Is it stress reduction only, or are there other possible mechanisms of action?
I think this is the only mechanism. There are few studies which were made, and they are comparing what is the quality of semen sample if it's collected at home and if on site, and they all concluded that the only change is the stress, probably acute stress, and it also influences, or it can influence, the outcome of IVF cycle. One study highlighted that probably there is a change in functionality of sperm, because the acute stress can increase the DNA fragmentation of sperm. But I think this is all. I don't think there is any other mechanism.
Okay, thank you. A question for Dr. Sharon.
Yes.
Your observation that the time interval, you don't have to wait after early pregnancy loss, can that be interpreted as that it's more an embryo factor than an endometrial factor that causes the early pregnancy loss? Would you agree with that conclusion based on your data?
I think not, because we saw that when we compared the population who achieved pregnancy to the population who didn't achieve pregnancy, we didn't see a difference in the embryos, I mean, in the blastocyst versus cleavage, or frozen versus fresh embryos. We did a comparison between the two groups, and there was no significant difference between the groups. I mean, that was our first comparison. And also the mean time for the pregnancy was not different. So my answer will be no.
Okay. Another question from Dr. Ben Makiki. Could you speculate on the rationale why IVF outcome is better when the interval after early miscarriage is shorter? So what would be the mechanism, could be the mechanism of action to explain this?
Well, I think that I could phrase it differently. I would say that we will expect sometimes that if we won't wait, maybe the result will be worse. And so in Israel, we don't have a problem of in terms of money. I mean, IVF treatments are sponsored by the government. So sometimes we are thinking maybe to wait, because maybe the implementation will be better in terms of miscarriages. But women in Israel are very anxious to get ready to the next cycle. So we thought at the beginning that maybe there will be a different, in the worse outcome. But we realized that this is not true. I mean, if we do start immediately after the miscarriage, we won't expect worse outcome. That's what we were saying.
Thank you. Maybe Laura, back to you.
Yes, I have a comment.
Focus on Mina's presentation. There are some comments there as well.
Yeah, there is a strong comment coming from a big expert, Professor Rastipour, Mina, but respectfully disagree on temperature sensitivity of the oocyte. The oocyte are much more sensitive to aging than to temperature modification. Would you comment on that?
Hi, Rusty.
He said excellent and elegant presentation at the end of the sentence.
At the end of it, just to balance it. Yeah. Well, he always has great questions and always makes me nervous to answer. And I didn't know he was in the audience. So, actually, I should point out that the nuances of temperature sensitivity were addressed during the consensus meeting. And I know that Rusty used to, I don't know if he's still practicing this, but he did used to manipulate, for example, at room temperature rather than on a heated surface. And his impression data were that it wasn't necessary to perform micromanipulation at 37. Now, I don't know if he still practices that way. But yes, there are nuances there. I think that the point is long-term exposure to low temperatures. And there was another point that was agreed that we would prefer to see exposure to lower temperature than higher temperatures. So, there are a lot of nuances there, and I would refer the audience to the paper to kind of understand where the discussion or how the discussion proceeded during the meeting on temperature.
Do we have
I hope Rusty is satisfied.
Of course, for me, but I have observed the depolymerization of a meiotic spindle during handling, even in few minutes exposure at lower temperature. And I know that the meiotic spindle is able to repolymerize, so I would put on the same balance temperature variation and aging. I think everything is connected, and the old side is really sensitive. Probably the sensitivity is inversely related to the stage of development.
Right, I agree with that.
I would keep all the condition at best. But do we still have time for a question?
I think maybe one last question and then we round up.
So I would come back to Mina because the audience is talking about humidity, but we also receive a lot of papers on these old, new parameters that we have to keep during embryoculture. So what do you think about humidity and how to keep it stable during all our manipulation at high temperature?
So this was a contentious point of the discussions, and in the end, it was a fine balance to actually word the consensus point in a way that satisfied everybody. First, there was a discussion between culture under humid conditions in incubators that provide humidity versus dry incubators. Most of the benchtop incubators are dry, and as is the EmbryoScope and other time-lapse incubators. There is concern about increasing osmolality via evaporation as a result of culture under dry conditions. There is some data that supports that notion that yes, the osmolality increases to a point that is not good for development of the embryos. However, I think we need more studies. I think we need more controlled studies and better studies to show truly what the impact is under different conditions. As far as the room humidity is concerned, the standard is 30 to 60%. And I think that, that requires a good HVAC system. And you cannot get around it. I know Dara had raised that point, that, how it's expensive to maintain a good HVAC system. And that's true. But there is unfortunately no way around it. You have to have a good control, you have to have a good HVAC system in order to control humidity in the lab environment. And the same for temperature. And of course, you don't want your embryologist to pass out because it's so hot or freeze because it's so cold. It has to be comfortable, but I would say between 21 and 25 degrees centigrade.
Thank you, Mina, to share all your experience. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Bart, do you still have a question to our excellent speakers?
No, I think so. Let's slowly wrap up.
Really?
Please, Nora, you first.
I want to continue. I love this session. No, okay, so I really would like to thank all the participants and especially the speaker, if I may say Martin, Fady, and Maya, and of course Mina. We are like a family tonight, so I use your names. And of course, I would like to thank first of all Bart that has allowed me to enter in the family of RBMO. In embryology, and of course it's a fantastic chief editor, really promoting the journal and promoting our work, so I'm very happy to be part of this family. So I also have to thank the organizing committee for the initiative: Jacques Cohen, Peter Nagy, Thomas Elliott, Shaista Saduddin, Giles Palmer, and Mary Says-Weitzetz. And also Dukan Nicholas, which is the development editor of Reproductive Biomedicine Online. And today there has been a very important person that has selected the question for us. Bart and I were reading, but somebody else was selecting and highlighting the question. So I want to really thank the triage team, which is Marianne, Saishta, Giles Palmer, and Dara Berger. So, Bart, unfortunately it's finished.
Thank you, Laura. You did very well, particularly with all the names. It's not easy.
No, it was a disaster. Sorry.
Okay, me too. I would like to first thank the I3 team and all the speakers. This is always improvising, but on the other hand, it is scripted and planned. I hope you as speakers enjoyed the session. I hope the audience enjoyed the session. Let me finish with a few words about RBMO in general and also about our next collaborative efforts. So RBMO is a journal that is looking for new opportunities all the time. We don't want to forget the past, so we want to remain strong in embryology. And indeed, it's been an honor to be with the two editors focusing on embryology together this evening. Certainly also basic science and andrology are important sections which may deserve a little more attention than it's getting now. You know, we don't want to, zoom in on just one aspect. We try to remain the broad scope. And it's not easy, of course. It's not easy as a journal, not backed up by a big society. So we have to fight all the time, which is good, which keeps us alive and keeps us awake. And so we will have two more opportunities to show you where we are. Number one is, this is about the next two joint sessions later the year. On the I3 website, you can look at the details. And one is about our new section, RTS. We refer to it as Reproduction, Technology and Society. And we had quite some discussion. And the idea is that we want to drift away a little bit from just being a scientific journal. Of course, we all know in reproduction there is so much going on in terms of society discussions, demographic developments, but also, of course, health economics. IVF centers become more and more big groups. What does that mean for the way IVF is practiced? How do sociologists, ethicists view what we are doing? So we are embarking on a new adventure, so to speak, and we'll have to see where it lands and how it lands. But at least this is going to be a topic of our next joint meeting. And the other one planned for later this year is andrology. Andrology is always under debate, that it doesn't get enough attention, that there's not enough progress. Let's all try to make it happen to have RBMO focusing on andrology as well. And I would like to invite all of you, the speakers and the audience, to keep on thinking about where we are, what can we do to improve, and hopefully give us your feedback about today's meeting. This may help us to further sharpen the sword, if you wish, and which may help us to even better design next meetings. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening, and hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Yes, Bart, we have to announce the next session.
Yes, and you?
Same time next week. It will be a session all about IUI. So the talks will be is IUI-ART, intrauterine insemination evidence-based guidelines for clinical practice, and data on donor IUI in single women, same-sex couples, and heterosexual patients. Incredible speaker, incredible team. So see you same time next week for the next session.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.